Welcome to the Radical Lifestyle Podcast, brought to you by Generation to Generation, where you will be inspired by the past, equipped for the present, and prepared for the future as we engage in conversations with people from around the world. Hello everyone, this is Andrew and Daphne from Generation to Generation, and our guest today is Justin Kron. Justin, for people that don't know who you are, can you just say a bit about where you're from and what you do?
So I live in the Windy City, also known as Chicago, or Chicago, also known as the Windy City, whichever way you want to look at it. But I've been living here most of my life and grew up and come from a background of a mixed background. So on my father's side, Catholic, on my mother's side, Jewish. And then in my teenage years, I became a follower of Jesus. And really began to learn how to reconcile, I guess you could say, my Jewishness with my Jesusness. And that eventually then led me into doing work in building bridges between both the Jewish and Christian communities and helping Christians better understand the Jewish roots of their faith, and just really how to better love their Jewish friends and neighbors.
Well, you've said a whole load of things there that we can dive into. So we're going to have you back to dive into some of those issues. But
be happy to.
In this conversation, we want to focus on a documentary that you made. For people listening to this that want to go and watch the documentary or find out more about what you're doing, where can they do that?
For the documentary, just go straight to hopeintheholyland.com. And if you want to learn a little bit more about me and my work, just go to a website that my parents came up with called JustinKron.com. We added the .com later, but there's a lot of different links there too. That one link will take you to the film. So if you just want one place to go, just go to JustinKron.com.
Okay, and you didn't decide to add the .com to your name legally?
No, not legally. I'm thinking about it though. Yeah.
Okay, well you can keep thinking. For those listening, those links will be in the description box, so they'll be there ready for you to go and check out.
Well, I like that phrase. I reconcile my Jesusness with my Jewishness. I've not heard that one before. I have to remember that one.
Remember that. So
I'll remember that. So, Justin, let's take us on the journey as to where the idea for doing Hope in the Holy Land came from. Why did you decide to do it? Can you start us somewhere near the beginning?
Yeah, so the beginning for me was a sensitivity that I had for many years regarding Christian anti-Semitism. And knowing the history of the church and its relationship with the Jewish people, and that the public relations policy of the Christian community with the Jewish community has not always been the best. And also then observing a growing hostility towards the nation state of Israel, the reconstitution of the Jewish state. And some films had come out that were targeted to the Christian community that were essentially conveying a story, conveying a message that Israel was the unjust oppressor of the Palestinians, and that the Palestinians were the innocent victims. And that to me seemed like really, really off. Now, I certainly had a sense that life was not easy for the Palestinians. I've led many tours to the Holy Land, have spent time in the Palestinian territories. And yeah, life is certainly not as free or as maybe uncomplicated as it is for Israelis who, or anyone who lives in Israel, both Jews and Arabs. Nevertheless, I really felt that these other films that had come out about 10, 11 years ago, again, weren't painting a fair story, a fair picture of the conflict. And I saw a lot of friends in my circles really starting to embrace that perspective, embrace that narrative. that Israel was the unjust oppressor. And I had the opportunity to go on, I guess you could call it an education trip that was sponsored by an organization. I'm not gonna name who they are, but the whole purpose of that trip was to educate evangelicals, particularly younger evangelicals, about the conflict by putting us in front of people on both sides of the conflict. And even within each community, within each society, there's differing opinions. And what I saw was that they were putting us in front of Israelis who, I guess you could say, probably had a more liberal view on the conflict. And then they were putting us in front of Palestinians, several Christian Palestinians, who were essentially blaming Israel for all of their problems. And I'm like, there are some voices that we're not being put in front of, that we're not hearing. And so I had met Todd Moorhead. So Todd, who's the central character in the film, kind of the guide for the viewers. I met Todd after he released his first film called Promised Land, Israel Through the Eyes of Surfers. It's a fantastic film if you want to grow your heart even bigger for what God is doing in Israel. I recommend watching that film. And Todd and I became very fast friends, and he was also observing a lot of the same trends and influences within the Christian community. And we both had a sense of, boy, it'd be really good if we could create another film that responded in some way to these other films and other really programs that exist, I think, to present, again, an unfair perspective, an unbalanced perspective on the conflict. So when you decide, though, to make a film, as you guys know, I mean, you've done one, at least. I mean, maybe you've done more, but there's funding. You've done one, so you've got to get the funding for it. You got to get the people on your team to do it, and that can always be a bit of a challenge. But God provided, and the end result, of course, is what anybody will end up seeing as they watch the film. I think it's important, though, that I add here too that not only did we feel that there was a lack of balance in some of these other films, but for us as followers of Jesus, we were challenged with the notion that, you know what, in our own journeys, we haven't really spent a lot of time getting to know the Palestinian people and in exploring what is God's heart for them. There's an acquaintance of mine who was very engaged in learning more about the conflict. And he said to me, a friend from church, he said to me, Justin, if your theology does not lead you to love your neighbor and your enemy, then something is wrong with your theology. And I knew in that moment that I had some soul work that I needed to do in my own life in regards to my heart regarding the Palestinian people. And I shared that with Todd, and he was challenged too by a professor from Biola who's done a lot of work in learning about Arab, Middle Eastern history. And she really encouraged him too. And one of the books that she had him read was Arabs in the Shadow of Israel by Tony Malouf, who just passed away last year. But that was a very helpful book for both Todd and me to set us on this journey of discovery to learn more about God's heart for both Jews and Arabs in the Holy Land.
Yeah, I think coming to a place where you love friend and enemy is probably somewhat of a lifelong journey. It obviously depends how big of an enemy that person is. But in that journey, for you personally, did you come to some sort of resolution on that before you went to film, or was that still in process during the filming?
I think it was very much in process during the filming. I think when you're going into uncharted territory and you're not very familiar with a particular people group, it's going to be a learning process. And I think too, in any friendship, as you're forming friendships with people, there's going to be ups and downs. There's going to be points of disagreement, and you're not always going to see eye to eye on things. And there's also this process of learning to build trust with people, and so for us, it was definitely an experience. A lot of that is captured in the film. There's some things that weren't. I'd be more than happy to expound on some of that. But yeah, I mean, it was really good for us, and I'm grateful that now today I can actually say that I've got real Palestinian friends, which I did not have when we started this.
Yes, that's interesting. And having done our documentary and watched yours, there are a lot of parallels, some differences, but a lot of parallels. And I can imagine that journey for you, going through it while also meeting these people and hearing some of the things that you would have heard, would have been quite the roller coaster. Yeah. So maybe we'll dive into some of those as we go along. For you, being in the Palestinian territory, going in out, meeting with some of these people, is there a certain meeting, a certain character that you met with that stands out for you, looking back on it?
Well, yeah. So if you watch the film, you're going to see that there's a Palestinian who essentially kind of serves as a guide for Todd on his journey when we're in the Palestinian territories, and we were just incredibly just encouraged. I'm not sure what other word to put to it. Regarding just his willingness to take risks, to be with us, to the point of where it might even jeopardize some of his friendships with other Palestinian neighbors of his. Because here he is, he's associating with a couple of Christians who are capturing both sides of the story, and there's a scene in the film where we get run out of a refugee village purely because these other Palestinians did not like the fact that he was not just bringing us into that neighborhood, but more so the fact that he was being a part of something that was going to present both sides. And sadly, for a lot of Palestinians, they really only believe that there's one side and that's theirs, and not really willing to listen to the other side. And so to get to know him and to see that, wow, here's a Palestinian who's willing to take real risks, far greater than I take here living in the United States, to bring the truth to the world. And then on top of that, he's a guy who sympathizes with the Israeli story. And that's just amazing to be able to get to know someone like that. And, now I can call him anytime and he'll pick up the phone, just like that, and ask, in fact, you want to know more about what's going on in my life and with my family here, and wondering, are you guys okay there in the United States? Some things don't look so good. So.
Things are bad when someone living in the Palestinian territory is checking on you.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
We took young people in, most of whom knew nothing. So when we took them into the Palestinian side, they were wide open with not many checks and balances, which was scary making the film, but we had to be authentic and just let it roll and see what happened.
Yeah, the heads were spinning.
Yeah, so that was a challenge. But I should imagine going in too with almost like your heart is in a position, you are Jewish and you already have a love for the Jewish people and you already have a love for the land, must present other challenges when you're going in and you're hearing all this. How was that for you, hearing what you heard and yet being deeply rooted with the Israeli narrative?
Yeah, just to give viewers right now just a sense of some of what we heard. We did several man on the street interviews within the Palestinian territories. We also did several in Israel, which did not startle us at all of what we heard. But what we did hear in the Palestinian territories was incredibly startling. So we asked like a series of questions. Just based on some information that we had gathered before we went in about some views that we were told some Palestinians hold. So we asked, do you believe that the Holocaust happened? Do you believe that the Jews were the perpetrators of 9/11? Do you believe that the Jews are trying to take over the world? Do you believe that there was a knifing kind of intifada, knifing attacks that were happening in 2015 and 2016 against Israelis. And we asked, do you believe that those knifing attacks were fabricated by the Israeli government? And to every question, to all of those questions, we received affirmation on every one. There was not one, for example, there was not one Palestinian that we spoke to who was willing to acknowledge that the Holocaust actually happened as it happened. We had one Palestinian who said to us, well, if it was 6 million, it was Jews killing Jews. But that's as close as we got to the acknowledgement that 6 million Jewish people had been killed. I mean, we were told directly by some, nope, it's a lie, or it was made up in order to gain sympathy from the world so that they can, come in here and take us over or whatever. To think for me as an American, to hear that they all believe, at least everyone we spoke to, believes that the Jews are the ones who are behind 9/11, even though, there's plenty of factual evidence that says otherwise, and that those views were so rampant. It was scary. And I'll give you another example. We were in Ramallah, which is essentially the capital city of the Palestinian Authority, and it's a middle to upper class city. You go there. People are driving nice cars. There's boutiques and a mall and cafes. This posed a real big conflict for us. On one side of the street, there was a Popeye's chicken, and then on the other side of the street, there was a Kentucky Fried Chicken. So if you want to start a real chicken war, you can go right there.
Yeah, that's a real problem.
Yeah. So we're walking down Main Street, and I don't remember the actual name of the street, but it was the main street of Ramallah. And there is a guy selling used books. And I'm telling you, you could not get more in the heart of Ramallah than where we were at this moment. And one of the books that this guy is selling is Mein Kampf by Adolf Hitler, which many, historians consider to be the most dangerous book ever written. And I would agree. Here's Hitler's diatribe against the Jewish people, and it's being sold like it's any other book. And we watched dozens of people walk by who easily could have seen the book. Hitler's face was on it. There was a swastika on it. And it didn't bother anybody. Now imagine in your town where you live, if you saw somebody selling that book. I think that could concern you. It would startle you. If you were walking with someone, you would probably say to the person you're walking with, "Oh my goodness, do you see what that guy is selling? I mean, that's insane." But there was none of that type of reaction. And so to experience the level of anti-Semitism that we did was really difficult, heartbreaking, and helped us, I think, better understand too some of the fuel that continues to be fed into this conflict.
What's really sad is actually I can think of probably parts of England where if they walked down the street and saw a Mein Kampf, they probably wouldn't be too uncomfortable with it in this day and age, which is tragic, and that's a subject worth exploring at some point. What are you wanting to say?
I'm just going to say, of course, to turn a nation, you have to take the next generation.
Which leads on to what I was about to say.
Well, you were about to say that
well,
too.
I was about to say...
sounds familiar.
Yeah. It's... when we think about the Palestinian territory, it can be very easy to think of all of them together. And we tried to separate out thinking about the Palestinian leadership and the Palestinian average person and think about them in two different ways. Because there's a reason why a lot of people in the Palestinian territories have a certain perspective about the Jewish people. And in your documentary, you talk a lot about the education in the Palestinian territory and UNRWA and the things that they're doing. And when you educate everyone with a certain narrative, obviously the outcome, generally speaking, will be what they want it to be. Can you talk into some of that? Because a lot of that will be why people are coming out the way they are and having the views that they have.
Yeah, well, I think you've just nailed it. I think you have the Palestinian leadership that's funded and supported by the United Nations and others within the international community that does not hold them accountable, truly accountable. I think they gave a lot of lip service to it, but true accountability in regards to how they are using those funds to educate their society, particularly the younger generation. And if you continue to have textbooks that don't acknowledge Israel's right to exist or even to teach the Holocaust and to help people be sympathetic to the Jewish story, then you're just gonna have this cycle that repeats. And so it takes a tremendous amount of effort, and I would say even courage, for the average Palestinian to step outside of that bubble, that information bubble, to really get to the truth. And part of what we capture in the film is, again, this Palestinian guide who led Todd throughout the Palestinian territories is him saying about how his perspective was able to change as a result of spending time with Israelis.
So you mentioned at the beginning, if you'd like me to talk about some of the things that didn't make the cut that happened. How about you tell us some now?
Yeah. So we did put part of it in the movie. So there was a Palestinian. We were on Mount Ebal, and this is not what's captured in the film. So we didn't really tell people exactly where we were located, but I think it's interesting for some to hear. So we were in Nablus. So Nablus is in the Bible. That's Shechem in Hebrew scriptures in the Old Testament. Shechem, Jacob's well, right? So, and that story then continues into, or that location continues in the New Testament, but it's known as Sychar. And this is where Jesus, Yeshua, has this conversation with the woman at the well. And so we are up on Mount Ebal, which is across, on the other side of the valley. So Shechem or Nablus today sits in a valley. And then on the other side of the valley is Mount Gerizim. And so this is what's became known as the Mount of Curses, where Moses had the people read the curses, right, for the people of Israel. And then on the other side, Mount Gerizim, the Mount of Blessing, where the blessings for the people of Israel were read. And so our guide, he takes us up to Mount Ebal. And Todd we're filming Todd talking to our Palestinian guide. And I'm off in the background, as producers do. And there's a Palestinian man who probably in his mid-40s, pretty weathered with life. And he just asked, so, what are you guys doing? And I was like, well, we're making a film about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and really trying to get below the surface of what's really going on. And he says, oh, that's really good. But it goes much deeper than you think. And, making a film, being a documentary filmmaker, you think, oh, but this could be some really good content here. I'm going to ask him, before you share what you're about to share, would you mind if we recorded you, if we filmed you? And he's like, oh, no, I don't want to be filmed. Well, our director, he had taught us, like, if you're ever in a situation where you think you might be getting some really good content, if we can't get it on film, at least try to capture the audio. And so that's what I did. I said, can you just give me a moment? I've got to text ahead to our next contact. But what I ended up doing was I hit record on my phone, put it in my pocket, and then let the conversation ensue. What he then ended up sharing with me was quite startling. And we redubbed it in the film so it looked like, or sounded like, Todd was having the conversation with this gentleman. And he said to me in this conversation, the guy said that the Jews are regathering in Israel, or in this land, for their final destruction. And he said, this is what our prophet Muhammad has told us would happen. And then he points to a tree, and he said, you see this tree? A day is coming when this tree will say to me, my Muslim brother, there is a Jew hiding behind me, come and kill him. And he was quoting, of course, a hadith of Islam. And I know that hadith is actually also in the Hamas charter. Now, what I found particularly interesting, in fact, I would say even startling, was that this gentleman, he said, I'm not religious. And I could tell by looking at him, he was not religious. But yet, he still believed this to be true. And I asked him, do all Palestinians or most Palestinians believe this? He said yes. And he was emphatic that this will happen. He doesn't know when. He said he didn't know when, but he said it will happen. And just the more and more that we spent time there, and we just dug below the surface, there was always kind of this religious ideology that would come up. That really paints the Jewish people as the supervillains of the world, and that Islam is going to help eradicate this sickness or cancer or whatever you want to call it, or whatever they want to call it, and that a day is going to come to where Muhammad and his followers are going to be victorious, not just over, of course, the Jewish people, but over Christians as well. And you hear that, you experience that, and you realize, wow, the real conflict here, what's really at the heart of this conflict, is not so much about land. It's not the politics, but it's really over about whose God is the real God. Whose God is God? Is it the God of Islam? Is it Allah? Or is it the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob? And if you don't understand the heart of it, then you're going to misdiagnose everything else that is going on.
Of course, it is sobering to know that we too believe there's going to be a final conflict, that we too believe we're going to see whose God is God over it. And I think so often there is, and this is a whole other topic, but there is this overlay which can confuse many people and lead many astray. But that is certainly a moment for us all, to perhaps press pause on the podcast and just think about what you've said for a moment. But so we don't have a long gap while everybody has that pause. Justin, that is so profound. Is there anything else you want to share that was that didn't make the cut before we move on to your experience in the Israeli side?
Yeah, so we had to completely cut out our experience with a security official who lives near Gaza. And it lives in one of the towns not far from the Gazan border. And just some of the stories that he shared about the fire balloons that have been sent out from Gaza to burn all the crops and such, and then even about the rockets that Hamas fires. And we were near a kindergarten, and he showed us an exact spot where one of the rockets landed, which was just literally a few feet from this kindergarten building. And so just for the sake of time, we had to cut that out. But we still feel that in the film itself, we were able to capture some of what's going on in Gaza. And really what's most important is the ideology of Hamas. That again really does continue to keep this conflict going.
So you've helped us to dabble a bit into what happened in the Palestinian side, and we have to watch the documentary to find out more. So can you take us now on a little insight into what happened on the Israeli side of the security barrier?
Yeah, so on the Israeli side, what we discovered is a real heart to want to come to a resolution with the Palestinians, and a good level of real compassion for the Palestinian people, and sadness over the fact that the Palestinians are being poorly led. And this doesn't mean that every Israeli has compassion or empathy for the Palestinians. I mean, there's some who are just they're busy with their lives and doing life, and they don't think about it much unless there happens to be a conflict that flares up. And even for them, I think it's important for viewers to know that when conflicts do occur, like we saw recently back in May of this year between Israel and Hamas, that doesn't shut down life for every Israeli. It's very similar for me here where I live in Chicago. Sadly, there's a lot of gang murders that happen, people who are dying on the streets every day, which is incredibly tragic and incredibly dangerous, right, to be in those areas for those who live there. But for me, here I live just 30 minutes away. if there's no traffic. But my life goes on as normal. So, just to help viewers know that, the situation with the conflict, it's not constantly on the minds of every Israeli. But
yeah, because if you're in another country and you haven't been there before, if all you see is the news, you would think that these conflicts impact everyone, everything's shut down. But we've been out there during conflicts, and if you're in certain places, you just carry on, and you wouldn't even really know there's one happening. So.
In fact, that was one of the lies that came in with the young people. As I say, that they were very ignorant of things, but one thing that they were told before they came: you will die if you go there. From
people in their country said, you're going to Israel? Oh, wow.
You'll die.
Good luck.
They still came, but that's what they were told. So, it's worth emphasizing that.
Yeah. Well, and I tell people, well, good luck when you drive your car then, because, a lot of people die in car accidents, but yet we still drive. So, in fact, we're more likely to die in a car accident than we are to be killed visiting Israel. Much greater. So, it's all a matter of perspective, and I think being there, and just related to the conflict, if you really want to better understand the conflict, spend a good amount of time with the people who are there. But that's not possible for everyone, which is why we made a film, which is why you made a film about it, to help people get on the ground, if you will, and to really hear things that sadly the media and a lot of organizations who say that they're committed to trying to help bring peace aren't sharing. And so, I think that's one of the beautiful and powerful things about films, is they can really help people get to the truth.
Yeah. I loved seeing you meeting with Colonel Danny Terza. I love that guy. He's great. We meet with him quite often when we go out there, and he was in our documentary as well. And we so appreciate his heart. For people listening that don't know who he is, he's the one who was in charge of building the security barrier. So he's the one who basically built the apartheid wall, as some people might say. But obviously we don't think it's an apartheid wall. You have to watch the documentary to find out why he built the wall and why it was put where it was put. Yeah. There are legitimate reasons. But we so appreciate his heart, and I often get choked up when I talk about this. Hopefully I don't this time. But you talk about how so many people actually want this security barrier taken away. Yes. They want the reasons why it's there to cease to exist so they can remove it. And Danny talks about how he hopes that one day he will be the first person to remove the first brick from that security barrier, that they may be able to live in peace with their neighbors, the Palestinian people. Can you talk more about maybe some of the interactions with him? What were some of your takeaways from hearing from Danny? I think that, because of what he was involved with, he could be seen as someone quite central to a lot of the conflicts that are going on, a reason why so many things maybe happen. Yet when you actually get to talk to him, maybe people might villainize him, but when you talk to him and hear his heart, actually it's a very different situation.
Yeah, here's an Israeli who, is trying to help protect his people, who cares deeply about the lives of Israelis. I mean, that's what, anyone who serves in the IDF, anyone who's a government leader, that's what they're responsible for doing, to protect their people. It was very touching, though, for us to hear just, I think, how difficult it was for him to have to build that barrier, and the heart that he put behind it in trying to, as best as he possibly could, build it in such a way that it didn't overly disrupt people's lives on both sides. Knowing that it would regardless, I mean, it was going to disrupt, people's lives at some level, but that he was sensitive to that. And people might say, well, no, he wasn't, and accuse him of, like he was just thinking about Israelis and not the Palestinians. But let's be honest, that wall has saved lives. And in fact, I would say not just on the Israeli side, but even on the Palestinian side. And so I just really appreciated his heart. And you'll get, anybody who watches the film, I think, will as well. And I just love, he pointed out to us there was a little bit of a temptation for us to name the film after what he said, which was The Whole of Hope. But we thought that might be a little bit confusing, like what's the whole of hope? But so what the whole of hope is at the top of these concrete barriers where there's an actual wall on the security barrier, there's a hole at the top of it that was used for when the crane put it down, and it's the same hole that can be used to remove that concrete barrier. If so ever there's a peace agreement and they can remove the wall. And he calls that the whole of hope. And he expresses how he would love to be the first person who could remove that first barrier. And I believe he genuinely that or dreams of that. And I think it's good for people to know that Israelis, they aren't heartless people. They're real people who have compassion for their neighbors.
Yeah. So often you just hear they just put the wall up to take Palestinian land, and he goes into great details about the lengths that he went to try and accommodate everyone in a situation that no one wanted. No one wants to have this ugly looking wall running through the land. And even, people may not know, but if sadly they did have to go through someone's land, there's actually compensation, which is sitting in a bank ready for people to come and claim their compensation for the damage that was done. Sadly, none of them have come to claim that compensation because of fear of what would be done to them on the Palestinian
side. Right, because
side.
it's seen as taking money from the enemy and affirming the legitimacy of Israel if you take any money from them. So so it's unfortunate that's the view. But let's continue to hope and pray that a day comes where that wall can be taken down, that barrier.
Of course, we don't want to give away too much because we want people to go and watch the film. But so I'll just throw this out there. Actually, it's not all a wall. I won't tell you what the very
That's
small
true.
proportion is a wall. So you have to go and watch and find out what's going on there.
And I just want to say this too, because it's not said in the film, but I think people need to remember there's a lot of security barriers that exist between many, many, many countries in this world. And that even if there was a peace agreement of some kind between Israel and the Palestinians, there's nothing inherently wrong with having a barrier between your two countries along whatever your agreed upon border is. I mean, you try to come into just try to come into the United States from Mexico right now. You go to Tijuana, you might potentially be sitting in a line for 3 to 4 hours before you can get into the United States. And while we do capture in the film what it's like for Palestinians to have to cross through the checkpoints into Israel proper, and how frustrating that can be for some of them to have to wait an hour or two or more, that's not untypical for a lot of people around the world who are traveling between two countries. So I think it's just, again, it's important to have that greater perspective so you can better again see what's really going on.
So you dive into several of the hot topics, as it were, like settlements, and help people to understand that. Is there anything else you want to say about the Israeli side before we move on to what I think could be our last conversation?
Not that I could think of at the moment. I'll say this: there have been a number of Israelis who have seen the film, who have expressed tremendous gratitude that we made the film and that we captured the perspectives of Palestinians. Unfortunately, even within Israel, there are many Israelis who just have not really taken the time to hear those within the Palestinian territories share their stories. And so I think what Israelis are finding is it's helping even them just become more sympathetic, even empathetic with their Palestinian neighbors. And I'll say this too, I think real genuine empathy is what leads to real genuine compassion.
Yeah.
Without empathy, you'll never have, I think, true compassion for the other.
Yeah, you're right. There are so many in Israel that actually haven't had, and it's not necessarily even their fault. Sometimes they haven't had the opportunity to engage with a Palestinian and hear their perspectives. I know when we came back from filming in the Palestinian territory, we went to have lunch at a building, and there were some people there that we were going to end up filming with. And as soon as we arrived, they went running to the young people. What did you see? What did you hear? What did they say? And they were so interested to find out what was the engagement like, because they hadn't themselves had the opportunity to go and do that. And so they were so eager to find out more about what was said.
Well, they're not allowed in to do it.
Well, they're not allowed in to do that, which
is a whole other story.
It's a whole other story.
So we've covered the Palestinian side, the Israeli side. We've talked about you a bit. Where does the Bible stand in all this, or how did you hold the biblical truth in the midst of all this? Because I should think holding biblical truth while having empathy can be a tension, or holding biblical truth and having no empathy might be a tension. How did both of you navigate that?
Yeah, so both for Todd and me, I mean, we firmly believe that, Israel, the nation of Israel, is the apple of God's eye, that God promised to return the Jewish people back to their ancestral homeland, to land that he promised to them, and that Israel has a divine right to be there. Now, we don't believe that means that Jewish people can walk into the home of a Palestinian and say, right here in our scripture, it says that this land that your house on is mine, therefore get out of your house. Okay, so just to be clear, we would never be supportive of that. In fact, we didn't meet any Israelis who would support that. And so we believe that. We also believe that Israel increasingly is going to become isolated in this world. Prophet Zechariah said that God's going to make Jerusalem a cup that sends the surrounding nations reeling, dispersing, running away. You run away from something, that leaves that particular thing that they're running away from isolated. And we see a growing isolation of Israel in our world today. We know that there's going to be trials and tribulation for the people of Israel, and so there's some people who would say to us, Justin, why are you even bothering making a movie that encourages peaceful coexistence between Arabs and Jews, when the Bible makes it very clear that at some point in history, the Jewish people are going to be isolated and attacked by not just their Arab neighbors, but by the entire world. So why are you bothering trying to encourage people to stand with Israel? And I'm like, okay, do you not also read the same passages that have commanded us to be peacemakers and to do what we can to live at peace with everyone? I mean, to show real genuine compassion, again, to love your neighbor, to love your enemies. I mean, what are you going to do with those teachings? And so I think it's the both and realizing that you don't have to live in one camp or the other. And I mean, for example, I mean, we were told by Jesus that in the end days there's going to be an increased lawlessness, right? Where people aren't following the law. Does that mean knowing that day is coming? In fact, I think in some ways we see that even here in our day, lawlessness. Yeah. Does that mean we should just say, oh, well, we don't need police anymore. We don't need the courts. We don't need judges. We don't need to encourage justice. I mean,
let's just descend into chaos now.
Right. Yeah. So because everything's going to, go to, as they say, hell in a handbasket, right? That we should just stand back and just let that all happen. So to me, it just doesn't reconcile with the teachings of God's word to do that. And I do feel that we have a responsibility to be peacemakers and to bring God's wisdom and insight into these conflicts.
Yeah. When we were considering taking the young people into the Palestinian side, we had very strong voices saying to us, you can't do that, they will get taken in by the propaganda, you will lose them, and a lot of those sort of warnings. Well, we knew from the onset we were going to keep quiet, and we just had to let the documentary take its course. So we didn't allow that to influence us personally.
So the young people could have come out pro-Palestinian, and that would be the end result.
Well, some of our donors were concerned about the same thing.
Yeah. But we got some very sound advice from an organisation in Jerusalem called Stand With Us. I don't know if you've heard of them.
Yep, very familiar. They're here in the US. Yeah.
Right, yes. So we went to them, and they had somebody from the Palestinian Authority speaking to a lot of young people. And we said to them, are you not concerned that they're going to get influence? This was in their offices. And they said this, if you are sure of the truth, there is no problem in exposing the lie.
Yes.
Or the misinformation, or whatever you like to call it. And that was the basis that we did this, that if we know the truth, there is no reason at all why we can't listen, have empathy, see where they're coming from, because we are grounded in the truth. And
it's the basis for our judicial system, right?
Yeah.
You put a jury up in front, and you allow them to hear both sides, and you let them make the decision on what they believe to be the truth. And that's exactly what we did in this film. You did it in yours. I think, when viewers are actually presented with various perspectives, they will come to the conclusion that Israel does have the right to exist, and that the Palestinians are primarily being oppressed by their own leadership, the Palestinian Authority, who refuses to accept. Sadly, continues to refuse to accept Israel's right to exist as the sovereign state of the Jewish people.
Yeah. I want to encourage people listening to go watch your documentary. Your documentary, our documentary, we touch on subjects that you can go much, much deeper into. I want to encourage people not to just see short clips on social media, pictures, TikTok videos, whatever they are, and take those and build a whole narrative off of those short clips. To go watch more lengthier documentaries diving into these issues, but then use those as springboards into diving deeper into these issues to really research this stuff. We've appreciated your work, your documentary, which does a great job of doing that. And so I really want to encourage people listening to go to the links, watch the documentary, and don't just stop there either. Continue to dive into these issues so you can form more holistic perspectives around a subject which is extremely complicated. So Justin, thank you so much for taking the time. We really appreciate you coming and sharing more about this stuff.
Yeah, thank you, Justin.
My pleasure. Andrew, Daphne, just appreciate you both and thank you for the great work that you're doing.
Thank you.
Thank you, Justin. Thank you for listening to this episode. If it inspired you, please rate us and subscribe on Apple or Google Podcasts, Spotify, or another podcast platform.